Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion about biogeochemical cycles. Now, there's a lot kind of going on in that first term, and let's kind of take a moment to anchor where that is kind of breaking up our content. So, bio, we said, means life. We are looking at the interaction of these substances and how they are present in and outside of living things. Geo should make you think like geological, like positions in the earth. Where are these substances being stored or coming from? And chemical is getting at the fact that we are looking at forms of matter. So we are looking at how matter cycles between living and non-living components of ecosystems. So remember that we've been talking about the fact that matter and energy behave differently within ecosystems. So when we look at this example of a water wheel with like a river or a creek, we see that the water would be an indication of the energy. So the water has a source, okay? The sun would be the source of energy for all living things. And then as that energy is transformed and moved through living things, at some point there's going to be an end where the energy is lost. That could be in use by a living organism, in movement, in production of material, something, but the energy gets used up and it's lost essentially at the end as heat. Typically, a lot of energy is lost as heat as a byproduct of many other things that living things do. Matter, on the other hand, would be like the wheel. Matter is going to cycle, and we should really emphasize the idea of recycle. So, matter is going to continually move back and forth between biotic and abiotic sources. So, it's going to move into living things and back out of living things again, unlike the energy that has a beginning and an end. And our goal in the next few slides is to explore some of the different critical forms of matter to living things and how it moves between living and non living sources. So we've just mentioned that Earth recycles, and there are definitely different ways that that matter cycles. So we mentioned that biological would be the living processes that convert forms of matter. Geological would be more of the earth-based processes, think like volcanoes and seismic events, um, erosion, weathering, that sort of thing. Chemical and physical processes, that's kind of a blend of some of that, but then also think like reactions. So there are naturally occurring chemical reactions that happen in nature. And then human activity. There are a lot of places and ways where humans impact those chemical cycles. So when we think about the types of matter that living organisms need, water is a big one. And then there are other certain elements that are critical to the processes of life. So hydrogen is big as a component of water. Oxygen, we said, is really important for respiration. So when organisms process energy, we need oxygen as that final electron acceptor. Carbon is like the basic component of molecular structures. So when we think of proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids, these are our biological molecules that have carbon as the backbone. Biological molecules. Nitrogen, we said, is important in amino acids. Sulfur also plays a role in some of those as well. Phosphorus is critical for DNA. And there are many others that are in small amounts. But the idea is that living things need to take in these different forms of matter. So as we look at these, what I want you to really consider is whether a certain step is a biotic source of the substance or an abiotic source. So is it currently in a living or a non-living source? And as we start to see where these cycles occur, we're going to see this constant cycling between living and non-living sources of the compounds or elements. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the water cycle. So notice that evaporation and precipitation is a really big portion of the water cycle. A lot of the water cycle happens between the ocean and the atmosphere. So when we look at these other examples, they represent actually a much smaller portion of the water cycle. Then think about the ocean takes up a very large percentage of Earth's surface. So it makes sense that a lot of the water cycle happens there. Now, one key biotic event that I want to point out here is transpiration. This is the movement of water from plant roots to the leaves. So as evaporation occurs at the leaves of plants, remember that plants are going to use some of that water for photosynthesis, but it's also one of the ways that we move water into a living thing. So as that photosynthesis uses water as a part of the process, so remember carbon dioxide and water are combined to create oxygen as a byproduct and sugars then as the important product to the plants. That's in one of the biotic interactions. So here we see a lot of abiotic interactions. This plain evaporation, precipitation, this runoff from precipitation, percolation through the soil and the ground. This is all abiotic sources. And interestingly enough, outside of transpiration, the biggest thing that we're not accounting for that's biotic would be animals drinking or taking it in. So any organism, animals and plants that take in water as a part of their structures or as a part of their needs for processing things would be a biotic source. The majority of what's present on here would be abiotic. Now, how do humans impact this cycle? Think about our use of water and how we capture that. We're going to often impact lake levels and rivers as they get dammed up or they are sources of drinking water. Different production processes need water for cooling methods and things like that. So when we start overusing or pulling more than what the natural environment is used to, that can shift some of the percentages or proportions of water in any part of the cycle. Next up, we have the carbon cycle. Remember we mentioned earlier that carbon is a part of all of those biological molecules. It has that benefit of having essentially 4 covalent bonding spots to make very large chains of molecules. So when we look at our cycle here and we think about an atmospheric source of carbon, carbon dioxide, this would be one of those abiotic sources. When plants take it in for photosynthesis, this is moving it into a biotic source in the plants. The plants are able to convert that into those biological molecules, and then as they are eaten by herbivores and omnivores, that helps keep the carbon moving through the biotic system. When we think about decay, that's another way that matter can return to the soil. So organisms that help decay return that to a abiotic source. We also say here that in a human impact, when we have CO2 entering the atmosphere from production of different products, that would be one of those ways that we impact the cycle and potentially sometimes contribute more CO2 than would normally occur if we were not having those factories working. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a major abiotic source of carbon in ecosystems, moving it then into biotic through plant photosynthesis. As plants exist as a source of food for other forms of organisms, then they continue to move through biotic sources. And then once organisms exhale or emit CO2 through the process of respiration, that's returning it back to the abiotic source. The nitrogen cycle. This one has kind of an interesting step because without the help of some special bacteria, living things would not have a way to capture and use nitrogen. The key part is in the form of nitrogen that exists in the atmosphere. Atmospheric nitrogen is elemental in the form of N2 molecules. Organisms can't chemically do anything with that form of nitrogen. They're not able to incorporate it into their molecules or to process it. So what we're really lucky to have is specialized bacteria that are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And what they do is they convert the nitrogen into more usable forms, such as nitrates, ammonium, nitrites. So when it gets bonded to oxygen or hydrogen, plants can use that form of nitrogen much more effectively. So one place we see them working is at interactions with certain species of plants that makes it easier for these plants to access that nitrogen. We see soil bacteria that in converting it to these forms make it easier for other plants to get to it. Bacteria play a huge role in many of the conversions of nitrogen in its different forms to make it more accessible to plants. Once it's into plants, animals and decomposers can access that nitrogen as well. The last step then is that there are bacteria that need to return the nitrogen back to the N2 form. So in the same way that we have nitrogen fixing bacteria, we have denitrifying bacteria that can take things like nitrates, break it apart from the oxygen, and reform the N2 gas as it exists in the atmosphere. So atmospheric nitrogen would be my abiotic source. And then many of my biotic sources are moving through these different important bacteria before reaching plants and then eventually many of our other consumers. Ooh, a big thing, how do humans impact the cycle? One of the sources of human impact definitely can relate to use of fertilizers and things like that. So ammonium and nitrates are things that are used by farmers to help supply plants. Obviously, we see here that they naturally need that. But as farmers use them in certain forms and maybe potentially overuse them, they can disrupt the balance within an ecosystem and shift some of the nutrient load into an unsafe or unhealthy environment. In some cases, we're able to reestablish healthy environments by recognizing what was lost during farming. So many times farmers will actually rotate crops. There's certain crops that really suck up a lot of the nitrogen-based nutrients, and then they would rotate it with something like these legumes that are able to then reestablish more nitrogen in the soil. The sulfur cycle, remember we said that they were part of amino acids, which means they are pretty critical to proteins. So sulfur is kind of an interesting one. It's not one that's maybe talked about as much as, say, water or carbon or nitrogen. But we see a lot of sulfur compounds coming from combustion of fossil fuels, eruptions of volcanoes, and then living organisms have ion forms of sulfur as well. So these would definitely be my abiotic sources. And things like in organisms living would definitely be biotic. Mining can release some of those fuels that would be a human impact because as we're accessing and burning those fossil fuels, that's releasing some of those sulfur compounds to the atmosphere. Many of these sulfur compounds will exist dissolved in water. So depending on their source, they can relate to acidification of oceans and acid rain. So sulfurs are things that we do tend to pay attention to. In recent years, there have been limitations on use of sulfurs in certain types of cleaning compounds. Their ions actually make them really good at breaking up certain types of grease or things like that. So we often see them in soaps, but we are trying to limit some of that to help minimize excess sulfur compounds ending up in the environment. Phosphorus, again, critical for DNA. Remember that phosphate is part of the backbone of DNA. So when we look at the phosphorus cycle and it incorporates into living things, that's where it's being incorporated most often. Phosphate can come from inorganic or the abiotic sources. So remember that we mentioned geochemical processes, weathering of rocks. As rocks are moving around, that makes the rock material more accessible. And then as water moves through those rock materials, it can pick up and dissolve phosphates. Those materials then can move throughout different places and get embedded into the soil. Organisms that exist in the soil are able to then help incorporate it into plants at the roots, as well as decomposers that create those healthy soil environments. Phosphates are another one that can often disrupt the balance in an ecosystem when in too high of levels. It kind of overshoots in some of those fertilizers, and then we grow too many of some of the producer level organisms, and it changes what's available to the consumers, where not all of the consumers necessarily can access quality food sources. So humans can definitely impact the amount of phosphorus that ends up in ecosystems, and fertilizer is a big part of that. So with that, we have gone over several examples. When you are working on a test or quiz, you will not have to memorize all the individual transitional positions of these compounds and elements within their cycles. But what you should be able to do is to identify certain types of abiotic or biotic sources of them given a diagram, and be able to follow the follow the cycle of matter through those different sources. So if given a diagram, be prepared to identify something as biotic or abiotic and be able to use the diagram to track the movement of these substances through that cycle.